biochemists and physiologists. This video is the first in our respiratory system series. This is all about respiratory anatomy. Our goals for this series of lectures are a couple of things. First, we want to understand the upper and lower respiratory tracts. We'll talk about those. We want to talk about the gross anatomy, the histology, all the good things. But we also want to talk about the lungs and the pleural membranes and any histology that'll come up there. Finally, we'll talk about physiology. So we'll wrap up our series with physio, and we'll talk about ventilation and how we control our respiratory rate. Before we discuss all of that, I think it's relevant to discuss what the respiratory system actually does, which is this process called respiration. So respiration. That's all of these four major tasks, and I'll zoom in on each of them so we can see. But when we think of the respiratory system, we think of the lungs, we think of breathing, but it's not just that. There's four major jobs here, so let's talk about it. So the four major processes of respiration are these guys. The first is ventilation, what you and I think of as breathing. Pulmonary, that word pulmonary means lungs. So that word pulmonary means lungs. And ventilation, think like airflow, right? So we have that term ventilation. And that term ventilation, there's actually two spots. There's inhaling, which the science word for inhaling is inspiration, so inspiration of air. And then there's exhaling. And exhaling, science word for that is expiration. Not expiring, but exhaling that air, expiration. The second job that the lungs do as part of the process of respiration is external respiration. So once we've breathed in, or once we've inspired air, then we have a bunch of oxygen coming in. And remember that in the lungs, we do gas exchange. We learned about this when we talked about heart, right? As part of pulmonary circulation, we do gas exchange. We bring in oxygen, drop off carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide gets exhaled out, oxygen gets put into the blood. And so that whole process here is exactly what external respiration is. The third thing we do is we need to transport those gases. So now that oxygen has entered, then we need to transport it. So oxygen is transported from the lungs to the tissues, and CO2 is transported from the tissues to the lungs. So oxygen goes to the tissues, and CO2 goes out the lungs. Fourth job that we do as part of the process of respiration is internal respiration. So at the level of the tissue, we want to do the same thing. We want to drop off oxygen, get rid of carbon dioxide. Because remember that our cells, our tissue cells, they use oxygen in the energy making process, and then they produce or make CO2 as waste. And that process of making energy in our cells is called cellular respiration. So we need that oxygen to do cellular respiration, and a byproduct of cellular respiration is CO2. So then we'll get rid of all of that. And notice that we can just backtrack to follow the pathway of CO2. So oxygen moves this way all the way down to the tissues. CO2 moves this way, and then, of course, out the lungs. So what does the respiratory system look like? It's not just the lungs. It is the lungs, but it's all of the structures that allow air to get into the lungs. And there's two major portions. So there's an upper respiratory tract, upper respiratory system or tract, and then there's a lower one. So the upper respiratory tract is everything that falls above this artificial dividing line, the larynx. I'm going to highlight the larynx. So everything that's above the larynx is part of the upper respiratory tract. So this is stuff like the nasal cavity, all that stuff up here. We have the pharynx, everything up there. So everything that's above. So upper respiratory tract is above the larynx. And then below the larynx and below, that constitutes the lower respiratory tract. So larynx and below. So we have the nasal cavity, that's where all the nose stuff is. We have the pharynx, that's the throat. In the oral cavity, we also have the tonsils, right? And also here, which is not shown, are the paranasal sinuses. So I'm just going to add in here. Paranasal sinuses. Sinuses are little holes or air-filled sacs within the cranial bones that we talked about back in Bio 430, but those are part of the upper respiratory tract. So it's all about being this pathway of air from the nose down, and then from the larynx down into the lungs. That's the lower one. So the larynx is also called the voice box. We'll talk about why in a little while. And then we pass from the larynx into this tube here, which is called the trachea. The trachea is also called the windpipe. Windpipe. That's your air tube, right? And then everything that's below it, we need to zoom in a little bit on that to see. So first let's talk about the upper respiratory tract. The nose. We'll start with the nose. The nose is the only part of the respiratory tract that we can see, but the nose, it does a bunch of jobs. There's an outside part and there's an inside part, so we're looking at the outside part right now. But the nose does a bunch of jobs. So nose, it acts as an airway for respiration. It moistens the air and it warms it before it gets to our lungs. It also cleans and filters air. We have some structures that do that, and I'll show you in a little bit when we get into the nasal cavity. The nose also acts as a resonating chamber for speech. A resonating chamber for speech. And this, we can modulate kind of how our voice sounds, right, with our nose. And if you plug your nose, then your voice sounds a little bit different. So that's kind of like an interesting thing about the nose. And then the last thing is it has olfactory receptors. And those are the ones that tell our brain that we're smelling stuff. So, smelling. Here, what we see is the external part of the nose. And what we see is that the bridge of the nose is like this part that goes down the center. And then there's a pointy part of that nose. And the pointy part of the nose, we have the bridge of the nose. Pointy part of the nose is called the apex. You can see that if you feel the bridge of your nose, like far back almost in between your eyes, and then the apex of your nose, those feel a little bit different, right? And that's because the apex of the nose is made of cartilage underneath. So the apex of the nose has cartilage underneath versus the bridge, that's actually your nasal bone. So the nasal bone constitutes where the bridge is. And then at that apex, we have a bunch of hyaline cartilage. So the apex with hyaline cartilage. We also have nostrils as part of the nose. The nostrils are called the nares. Two of them are So plural is nares. Those are just the nostrils, and then that part, the little flap of skin on the outside of the nostrils, that's called the ala. Okay, so that's the outer portions of the nose. Let's peel the skin back and look underneath. So when we look at all of these cartilages, they all have there's like pieces of cartilage, right? And they all have different names, but they're all hyaline cartilage. So looking into the nasal cavity next, this is all the inside parts of the nose of that nasal cavity. And what we see here is that we have the passageway of air, right? And we have that nostril, air is going in, and then we pass through this nasal cavity. Where we pass through in the nasal cavity, so this is the nasal cavity, we pass through nasal conchae. A concha, so one of these, singular is concha. Um, Conchae is like a shell-like structure, right? And so what we're looking at here is each of these are shell-like structures called concha. And I kind of think of these nasal conchas kind of being like almost like the swirly bit of a snail on its shell. Because what these guys do, this is a 2D image, we're trying to show a 3D thing, right? But they kind of curl underneath like that. And then that space that's created by that concha curling underneath, that space there is called the nasal meatus. So there's nasal meatuses, and they're named after where they are. So they're superior, middle, inferior, just depending on where you're at. Lining all of this structure is mucosa, and that mucosa, that's where we have all of those olfactory receptors. The next thing we have to talk about are the regions of the pharynx. The pharynx is the throat, and there's three major regions. First, we have the nasopharynx, that's the pink one. So everything that's in the nose, like the back part of that nose, is the pharynx. So the nasopharynx, the nasal portion of the pharynx. Then we have the oropharynx, the oral cavity part of it. And then lastly, we have the laryngopharynx, which is that last portion. And then the laryngopharynx is named after the larynx, which is located just right there. Okay, so let's talk more about the larynx. So this is the larynx. At the top of the larynx, this is an anterior view, right? So this is anterior view. At the top, we have this bone called the hyoid bone. The hyoid bone is at the kind of top of your throat, like what we would call a throat, just like out in the world. And it has these two little horny bits on it. These little horn bits are part of the hyoid bone, and we can kind of feel the hyoid bone if you kind of palpate gently the top of your throat. And then as you go down below, you'll notice that it gets softer. And as that your throat gets softer as you palpate from the outside, it's because we start to feel cartilage. So the first big piece of cartilage here is called thyroid cartilage. Thyroid cartilage makes up the biggest portion of the larynx, and it also has the laryngeal prominence. The laryngeal prominence is kind of like this pointy bit right here, and that's where the Adam's apple is. This cartilage here, this thyroid cartilage, can be larger, and this produces a deeper voice, right? And a more prominent laryngeal prominence because it's just bigger, right? And this is done under the influence of testosterone. So in lower levels of testosterone, we'd have a smaller thyroid cartilage, smaller laryngeal prominence. Higher levels of testosterone, larger thyroid cartilage, larger laryngeal prominence, just because of how testosterone affects that development. And then we have some more cartilages below. We have the cricoid cartilage down below. So that's the one that's like skinny here, and then it kind of gets thicker near as we branch out, and then it's especially thick around the backside, which I'll show you in a little while. As we move downwards, then we have these rings. And all of those rings, they have a name. They're called tracheal cartilages. So this is an anterior view of the larynx. Let's look at a sagittal section. Before we get too into it, I want to remind us of some structure and function here. So in digestive system, we just learned that we chew up our food here, we form a bolus, and then that food travels down into the esophagus. One of the things that is not so great about food is that it passes right by our windpipe. That's this front one here. In order to prevent food from passing into our windpipe, we have this structure called the epiglottis. In the epiglottis, can you picture if food comes down, we're close that epiglottis so that that airway is closed so the food only goes down the esophagus. It does not go into our lungs. So that doesn't happen because of the structure epiglottis. And then when we're done swallowing, it comes right back up to where it started because it's made out of elastic cartilage. So structure and function, keep that in your mind while we're talking. This is a sagittal section of the larynx. So just what we were just looking at, but zoomed in, and we've taken out the esophagus. So here we have that structure, the epiglottis. When we swallow, that epiglottis moves downwards. So it kind of closes off this whole thing so that food does not pass into here because we don't want that. We don't want food passing in there. So the epiglottis is made with elastic cartilage. And it's covered by mucosa, so that closes off all the things. And then we have those same cartilages that I was just talking about. So here we still have those the hyoid bone, that's bone. We have our thyroid cartilage, cricoid cartilage. Remember I told you it's skinny at the front and kind of gets bigger near the back. And then we have all of those tracheal cartilages. What's also here is that we have to think about the epiglottis. What does it cover? The epiglottis closes off this entryway called the glottis. The glottis is your vocal fold and your vocal cords. So epiglottis, I'll write this down. Epiglottis covers the glottis. Not shown in this picture, but I'll show you in just a sec. The glottis is two things. It's the vocal cords, vocal folds, or the vocal cords, and the space between vocal folds. Not found in this picture, but it's what the epiglottis covers, which makes sense because epiglottis is above the glottis. Okay, so what we're looking at here is a superior view. So this is superior view. What that means is that we're looking from the top down, down into the larynx. So what we're looking at here is we have this little bit of epiglottis here near the top. So both of those things are epiglottis. And then we have our vocal cords. Our vocal cords or vocal folds are these guys. So we have vocal fold, vocal fold, vocal fold, vocal fold. So from vocal fold to the other side of the vocal fold, that's the glottis. From the vocal fold to the other side of the vocal fold, that's the glottis. So note that the glottis is kind of like, it changes depending on how big or how small this opening is. Vocal folds, they produce sound, right? Because they're vocal cords, right? And they produce sound um, because they vibrate. So they vibrate, make little sound waves, right? Um, and they vibrate as we exhale air through this area. So air is kind of moving up and out, air is moving up and out. And again, that's causing these little vocal folds to vibrate. If the vocal folds are stretched, like they're made longer, or shorter, like they're made shorter, then that causes our voice to be either a higher pitch or a lower pitch. So if we pull our vocal folds taut and pull them tight, that produces a higher pitch sound, and then having those vocal folds be more relaxed is a lower pitch sound. And we do that by modifying that muscle tone around the larynx. But we can also affect our voice by the pharynx, the throat, how all of those structures are oriented. Do we raise certain structures, lower certain structures? We already talked about the nasal cavity can affect our voice. Our sinuses can affect our voice because all of those are resonating chambers, right? The shaping of the pharynx, the shaping of the tongue, the shaping of the lips also aid in sound production and how we modify our voice as it comes out. What's also in this picture are false vocal cords or vestibular folds. And those vestibular folds, they don't have anything to do with voice really. They just aid in closing up that glottis while we swallow. So they help the epiglottis do its job better. But they don't help with sound production. Okay, so the tracheal cartilages, they're round, but they're not circular. So they're round but not circular. They're kind of more like a horseshoe shape, I think of it. So what we're looking at is we've taken those tracheal cartilages, we've taken a section of it, and that's what we're looking at here. So we have trachea in front, esophagus behind, and those tracheal cartilages are horseshoe shaped. The thing that makes it a circle is this addition of the muscle. That muscle is called trachealis. It's smooth muscle. The cartilage is great because it helps keep the trachea open, while the muscle, this trachealis muscle, allows for some flexibility, right? Because as food passes through that esophagus, that's what this is, the esophagus, then if that food is a little bit large, then we can kind of push on that trachealis a little bit and have no big deals. The trachea is lined with pseudostratified columnar epithelium. That's a big word. Pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Pseudostratified means that there's one layer of column-shaped cells, but it doesn't really look like it's one layer. That's why it's pseudostratified. The cilia refer to these tiny little hairs. They kind of act like a broom. In there is also a bunch of goblet cells which release mucus. Both goblet cells and cilia, here's all those cilia here, aren't they so cute? Like little cellular brooms. They sweep away debris and keep them away from the lungs, so that's really good. Okay, so the trachea goes down and then it goes into the lungs, so we're going to zoom in on that. So trachea goes down, and then that trachea ends. The trachea ends at the bottom. And where the trachea ends is called the carina. It's the last tracheal cartilage. From there, from the carina, we kind of branch off into two bits. And because we branch off now, it's called something else. It's called from trachea, it's now called a bronchus. Plural of bronchus is bronchi. Like, have you heard of bronchitis? That's coming from these words here. Okay. So air passes into the trachea and then it enters the primary or the main bronchus. The main or primary bronchus. And then each of the lungs have their own, right? So we have a primary bronchus on the left, and then we'd also have a primary bronchus on the right. So we go from the primary bronchus And you get one of those per lung. So one primary bronchus per lung. And then from there, we have lobar bronchus. That's the next one. We can also call those secondary bronchus. They're called lobar because each of these regions of the lung, you see, there's 2 lobes of the lung. There's 3 lobes of the right lung. So all of those lobes are, because that's what we call it, the lobar bronchus. And then lastly, those bronchi keep branching and branching and branching until they're segmental or tertiary bronchus. Tertiary bronchus. And each of the lobes get a bunch of those too. And then these tertiary bronchus, they get smaller and smaller and smaller until we can't really call them bronchi anymore. We call them bronchioles or little bronchi. Notice that these bronchi, the primary, the secondary, the tertiary, they're all covered with that blue. That blue is the cartilage, right? So it's covered with cartilage, but as we branch and branch and branch and branch, we start to lose some of that cartilage, right? That cartilage slowly, slowly, slowly goes away. And then in between those bits of cartilage are smooth muscle. So as we get rid of that cartilage, then we have more room for smooth muscle. The epithelium changes too, and then there's, of course, more smooth muscle, like I mentioned. That's important to know because the nervous system has a role here. Under SNS stimulation, we can relax those bronchioles. We can relax that smooth muscle, right? And relaxing would then lead to dilation of those tubes that are breathing. The PSNS would cause bronchoconstrictions. Those are 2 words. So SNS would lead to bronchodilation. PSNS leads to bronchoconstriction, making those vessels or tubes smaller. And again, this is at the level of the bronchiole. So asthma is when those airways are narrowed, which is the bronchioles, right? And so certain asthma inhalers work by activating the SNS to cause bronchodilation. Okay, so now let's zoom in. So from the branched out, so we've come in through our bronchi, branched and branched and branched, and then now the last bronchioles, they're called terminal bronchioles. That's the last bronchioles that we have. Those terminal bronchioles turn into respiratory bronchioles, and then we lead into these little like clusters of grapes. The clusters of grapes are called alveolar sacs. So alveolar sacs are kind of like clusters of grapes. And then one of those grapes, just one grape, is an alveolus. So many of them are alveoli, singular alveolus. And that's a single grape. They're not really like grapes though, because grapes, they're kind of like their own thing, but all of these alveoli are actually connected. So you see how they're all connected, and they even have little pores connecting each other. So each of those alveoli still are connected. So the alveolar sac, that's that cluster, and then each of the little bubbles is an alveolus. And what happens here is the site of gas exchange. So we'll look at that. So we have much of a similar picture here. Here we have that terminal bronchiole and the respiratory one. So terminal bronchiole, respiratory one. And then we have the alveolar sac, and notice that there's tons of blood flow there, tons and tons of capillaries, because that's where gas exchange occurs. The walls of the alveoli are so thin, so oxygen and carbon dioxide can pass just by simple diffusion. Let me show you what I mean. So we've zoomed in from here to here even more, okay? So this is one alveolus, one of those grapes. Notice that each alveolus is connected to the other through those alveolar pores. So we connect all of those guys together. And notice how thin those walls are. This is simple simple squamous epithelium. And those cell types are called type 1 alveolar cells. They're just simple squamous epithelium. So type 1 alveolar cells are simple squamous epithelium. We also have type 2 alveolar cells. Type 2 alveolar cells are not so like continuous like the others. They're kind of just like interspersed, right? Those little green ones, those are the alveolar cells, the type 2 ones. And they release a substance called surfactant. Surfactant. Surfactant is kind of like this stuff that reduces surface tension, kind of like a soap-ish. We'll talk more about it in a little bit. But it coats the inside of the alveolus. So in my blue highlighter, it just kind of coats the inside of the alveolus to make sure that it's all smooth. We reduce that surface tension. I want to see more things in the proper color, so I'm just going to erase it. The other cell type that we have here are macrophages. Macrophages help get rid of bacteria and dust because we breathe in lots of dust and germs and things. Because we breathe in lots of dust and germs and things, the type 2 cells, they also release antimicrobial proteins. So all of these alveoli, they're really tightly stuck together, but in those little gaps, that's where our little capillaries are, and this is where gas exchange occurs. Notice that inside of the alveolus, we'd have lots of oxygen, so that will go into the blood, and then from the blood, we'll get rid of that CO2. So we'll add the CO2 into here, and then we'll breathe it out the lungs. We'll talk more about gas exchange in a future video. Okay, generally let's understand the pathway that air follows. The pathway that air follows. So first we start out in the nose. Nose. And then from the nose we go through the pharynx. The pharynx, we have the nasopharynx, we have the oropharynx, we have the laryngopharynx. From the pharynx, then we'll pass into the larynx. From the larynx, then we'll pass into the trachea. Then we'll hit those bronchi. We have the primary ones, the secondary ones, and we have the tertiary ones. First, second, and third level ones. So these are also called the main bronchus, the lobar bronchus, and the segmental bronchus. From the segmental bronchi, then we'll break off into bronchioles. We have tons of those. And then from the bronchioles, the last bronchiole, I'm running out of space. I would do this vertically if I had more space. The last bronchiole is called the terminal bronchiole. From the terminal bronchiole, then we go into the respiratory bronchiole. And now we're in those alveolar ducts and sacs. So alveolar duct. Passes into the alveolar sac. Remember, the alveolar sac is the cluster of grapes. And then one individual alveolus is the grapes. So there's many of them, so we'll call them alveoli. Alveoli. Cluster of grapes. That's not a W. Alveoli. And then gas exchange occurs, right? But doing this, though, that's a lot of different jobs that all of these things do. And so we can kind of make some divisions here, some artificial divisions. I'll use light blue. So from until the terminal bronchiole, we call this the conducting zone. The conducting zone means that we're conducting air toward the lungs. So putting air towards the lungs. And then the second part of it, I'll use yellow. The second part of it is from the respiratory bronchiole. And that's kind of just the rest of it, right? And we call that the respiratory zone. So where like we actually do a lot of respiring, right? Okay. We're going to finish up this video in just a couple minutes. You're doing so great. Stay with me. We only have a couple of slides left. So that's the pathway of air. We're finishing up with more of a macro view of the lungs and the pleura or the serous membranes around the lungs. Okay, so in the lungs, we have two lungs. We have a right one and we have a left one. And this is all in anatomical position. And each of those lungs have lobes. The right lung has three lobes. We have a superior one on top, so superior one. We have a middle lobe, that's the one that's located in the middle. And then the inferior one is the one that's located on the bottom. So 1, 2, and 3. Each of those lobes are divided by fissures, and those fissures each have names. So I'll highlight the fissures in light blue. We have the horizontal fissure because it's horizontal. And then we have the oblique fissure because oblique means like diagonal. The left lung is a similar story, but there's fewer lobes. So we have the superior lobe, the one on top, and the inferior lobe, the one on the bottom. And then we have those lobes divided by a diagonal line called the oblique fissure. The top of the lungs each have this like little pointy bit. That's called the apex. The apex of the lung is the top pointy bit. And then the base of the lung is the bottom flat part. And that's connected to that really, really important breathing muscle. I'm going to highlight it in pink, the diaphragm. So the diaphragm is that important dome-shaped breathing muscle. What's also here, we have to remember, in between the lungs is the heart. And the heart needs a little bit more space. And so because the heart is kind of a little bit tilted towards the left lung has this little divot in it. And that divot has a special name. It's called the cardiac notch. The notch that makes space for the heart. Each lung is also covered by a pleural membrane. So pleural membrane. And that's a serous membrane, right? And so here we have the serous membrane up here in the corner, describing to you what that covering looks like. So here is the lung, the organ, And it's a serous membrane, right? So it's nothing fancy. It's just we have a visceral layer attached to the organ, a parietal layer attached to the body wall. And then in between, we have that little cavity. And we know that serous cavities are filled with serous fluid. So that decreases friction and does all the serous membrane things. Here's a cross section to show you a little bit better view of those pleura, the lung pleura. So what we've done is we've taken a cross section here so we can see like the heart, we have the lungs, here's the vertebrae, so this is at the posterior, and then here's the sternum or the breastbone at the anterior. What we can see here is that we have the right lung and the left lung, but we have the pleura, the parietal, the visceral, all the things. We also have to remember that the heart has its own serous membranes. That's called the pericardium. So throwback to pericardium. We can also see how richly vascularized the lungs are, and that a lot of those blood vessels kind of follow that branching pattern of the bronchi because we want to make sure that we get all the way down to the level of the alveolus, right, for gas exchange. So that's where we will end this video. You did so great. So proud of you for making it to the end. I'll see you soon.